Okay, today's quick lesson in critical thinking is ambiguity. Ambiguity comes in four types: semantic, syntactic, grouping, and verbal. Golden rules of disambiguation. Always write a minimum of 2 sentences that disclose the ambiguity that you detect. Second, add no new meaning-bearing elements to what was given in the original sentence, and place information in brackets like the ones in this sentence when it is impossible not to add at least some contextual information. Thirdly, make sure none of the resulting sentences reintroduce the ambiguity that was present in the original sentence. And finally, make sure that none of the resulting sentences contain any ambiguity of any type. Why do we care about this? I didn't put a slide in here. Here it is. Why is eliminating ambiguity essential? First of all, we cannot understand the intended meaning of a sentence if it is ambiguous. Secondly, when 2 or more possible meanings are present in a sentence, that means different claims are being made, and that means that different truth values are possible. Ambiguity can be exploited in arguments to derive unwarranted conclusions. When this is done, we call it the fallacy of equivocation. Here's an example. The sign said, "Fine for parking here." Since it was fine, I parked there. And obviously, there's something wrong with that. By the way, we're really concerned with ambiguity in our course because we're primarily interested in argumentation. And if we are arguing, we know that all of our arguments consist of premises and conclusions, all parts of which are claims. Claims are either true or false. We'd like to endorse every claim that we possibly can, but we have to be able to discern whether or not it's true. If the claim can mean more than one thing, however, we can't give it our seal of approval until we know which of the 2 things is actually being meant. This requires that we get rid of the ambiguity that would otherwise be present. The types of ambiguity. First of all, semantic. This is the kind of ambiguity where the sentence is ambiguous due to the meaning of a word or phrase within the sentence. Syntactic ambiguity. The ambiguity in the sentence is due to the way in which the words in the sentence are arranged. So there's no word or phrase that's problematic, as in the case of semantic ambiguity, but rather it's that the way the words are strung together causes us not to be sure of the intended meaning of the sentence. So once again, we have a situation in which 2 or more meanings are possibly attributable to the original sentence that we're encountering, and we can't tolerate that as individuals who are engaged in the process of argumentation. Thirdly, there is grouping ambiguity. Grouping ambiguity is the kind of ambiguity where it's due to the fact that groups and individuals could both be referred to, and so when this arises, we have to get rid of it. And finally, verbal ambiguity, sometimes called spoken ambiguity. By the way, you won't find this in many textbooks. It's just that I think that the emphasis in most textbooks is on reading and writing and not sufficiently on listening and speaking, and so consequently I've introduced this 4th kind of ambiguity. This ambiguity is due to the fact that the sentence is spoken, but that ambiguity would not exist if the sentence were written. Now, if this was a longer presentation, I'd give you plenty of examples of each of these, but since this is just a little side presentation and an experiment, frankly, for one class, I'm not going to do that work that I would otherwise do in the classroom. Instead, I'm just going to give you a little quiz and try to find out whether or not we can identify the kinds of ambiguity that is present in each of the following examples. So, my money is at the bank. And the question is, what kind of ambiguity is this? My money is at the bank. So remember, one possibility is that it could be verbal ambiguity, and in that case, we haven't really talked about exactly what it is or how it works beyond the very bare bones description I gave you a moment ago. So I will just tell you it's not that. The other possibilities are that it is grouping ambiguity, in which there might be reference to one individual or to a group. And so you can consider this sentence and ask whether or not you think that kind of an ambiguity is present. The third possibility is that this is syntactic ambiguity. None of the words or phrases per se are problematic, can mean more than one thing, but rather the way the words are strung together make it difficult to determine exactly what the writer or speaker would have meant had they said, "My money is at the bank." And then finally, there's a possibility that this is indeed semantic ambiguity, where there is a word or phrase that can mean one or more things, in which case we have to get rid of that ambiguity. So which do you think it is? If you said semantic ambiguity, you were right. The ambiguity results from the fact that bank can refer to a financial institution, which in this case is the most plausible meaning, but it can also mean the sort of thing that defines the edge of a river. Notice that a nice case of trickery could result if you simply assumed that it referred to a financial institution. So you have to sort of use your imagination here for a moment and just imagine that you're trying to get back some money that you loaned to me, and I tell you that my money is at the bank, and you go off to a financial institution, whereas in reality I've buried it on the side of a river. So it's very important that we get rid of semantic ambiguity, as all other kinds of ambiguity as well, when they are present. What kind of ambiguity is this? She watched him paint with enthusiasm. So is it syntactic, semantic? Is it verbal, or is it grouping ambiguity? If you said that it is syntactic ambiguity, you are correct. And so if you think back to the golden rules, when we encounter any kind of ambiguity, we are required to write at least 2 sentences if we want to disambiguate the original sentence. So in this case, we might write, "It was with enthusiasm that she watched him paint." Or, notice it could equally mean, given the original sentence, what she watched was him painting with enthusiasm. So the problem with the original sentence wasn't with any of the words, it was the way they were strung together. We couldn't tell if he was the one experiencing enthusiasm as he painted, or if the enthusiasm should be attributed to her, that she was enthusiastic about watching him paint. But our 2 sentences, even though they're not the most eloquent sentences that perhaps we could have drummed up, they do at least rid the original sentence of the ambiguity that was present. What kind of ambiguity is this? Doctors make more money than nurses make. If you answered that this is grouping ambiguity, you are correct. Notice how we can disambiguate this, and in general, this is an easy kind of ambiguity to get rid of, because if you sense that there is a grouping ambiguity, you should be able to simply add the phrase as a group appropriately, as you see having been done here and here on both sides, and then write a separate sentence in which you write it as individuals in both cases. So doctors as a group make more money than nurses as a group make, or doctors as individuals make more money than nurses as individuals make. Just consider, doctors as individuals might make twice what nurses as individuals make, but there could be 6 nurses for every 1 doctor. In that case, nurses as a group would make more than doctors as a group. You don't want to lend your assent to any claims unless you know what is meant. So the whole point of getting rid of the ambiguity And so that we can say, oh, given that I now understand that you mean that the semantic value of your utterance is precisely this, you mean doctors as a group make more money than nurses as a group, then I can tell you that your claim is false, because there are so many more nurses than there are doctors. However, if your claim is that doctors as individuals make more money than nurses as individuals make, then your claim is true. And that's the crucial thing that we want to guard against, is making sure that when we say, ah, this is true or this is false, that we are interpreting the original sentence in the way that is actually called for. So by ridding it of ambiguity, we can simply ask the individual who wrote the ambiguous sentence, which of these two things did you actually mean? Or if we're not in a position to ask them, we can critically or carefully, helpfully point out that such an ambiguity exists and blocks understanding. And then finally, I have to talk my way through this one with you, since after all, it is verbal ambiguity. So verbal ambiguity is a kind of ambiguity. If you think back to the beginning of our presentation, verbal ambiguity is the kind of ambiguity that only occurs when you are speaking, but it vanishes as soon as you write it down. So let me just go ahead now and talk about verbal ambiguity. So if I say that I like ties, and so you go out and buy me a necktie, and I say, oh, why'd you do that? I don't really like ties. You might say, well, that's really odd, because I just heard you say the other day that you like ties. And I say, oh, wait a second, I meant THAIS. And you think, oh, you mean Thai people. And so notice that if TIE had been written down, then you would never have been tempted to interpret me as having being in a position where I was making reference to Thai people. But because I did it verbally, there is that temptation. And so this is what we want to identify as verbal ambiguity. Okay, that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for viewing, and happy, careful thinking.